It's February 28, 1993 in Waco, Texas. A helicopter flies over a cult compound called Mount Carmel, readying for a raid. Cult leader, David Koresh, looks at the helicopter exclaiming that they are finally coming for him. The ATF are there ready to rescue the women and children from the compound, and also take away all their illegal firearms. All the women and children are afraid of what's to come, while the men of the compound ready their guns. The ATF draw their weapons when David Koresh comes out to calm them down, saying there are women and children in the building. A gunfight ensues. Before we continue with that part, we'll see how it all led up to this and what they do in the cult. 9 months before the incident, David enjoys a run with one of his many children, Cyrus. During one of his sermons, the people love how he celebrates and preaches about God and the philosophy of life. Meanwhile, FBI agent Gary Eisner is trying to teach future FBI agents how to de-escalate hostage situations. He is brought to Idaho to deal with a current hostage situation that the ATF are having trouble dealing with. Mitch Decker, another FBI agent, is trying to call the shots to deal with an extremist named Randy Weaver who is anti-government. A sniper spots two armed men and Mitch tells him to take a shot. He only injures them though as they rush inside. The sniper ends up killing an innocent woman right in the face. Garrett tells Mitch to stop shooting and he can try to talk to Randy to de-escalate the situation. Meanwhile, one of the things that David Koresh and his group does is perform at local bars. He ends up meeting a random drummer named Thibodeau, who he enlists to come stay at the compound for the time being. Back at the compound, Judy tells her husband Steve Schneider that she's pregnant with David's child. He doesn't take the news too well and wants to leave. Judy says it was originally Steve's idea to join the cult. She hated the idea at first. Steve finally decides to stay to help his wife raise the baby. When Thibodeau tours the compound, he meets 19-year-old Michelle Jones and her daughter Serenity, who Michelle had at a very young age with David Koresh. Back in Idaho, Garrett tries to negotiate with Randy, whose son had died a few days ago. Gary is shocked to find out that Randy's wife was shot dead by a sniper. Gary realizes this negotiating is going to be harder than he originally thought. At night, Rachel Koresh, David's main wife at the moment, is a bit jealous about Judy being pregnant. The men bunk together and away from the women. Steve tells Thibodeau how amazed he is of David, who has memorized the Bible cover to cover. The next day, Gary has brought over Bogritz, another radical white nationalist who could possibly help talk Randy Weaver to surrender. Bogritz successfully convinces Randy to surrender. Innocent children are brought out safely as well, but a woman is now dead because of Mitch's orders. 6 months have passed and many people are protesting the ATF headquarters for their terrible response to the situation in Idaho. Even Bill Clinton is thinking about defunding the ATF, so they plan on taking down another radical leader to get on everyone's good graces. David Koresh is their target, who supposedly spent $200,000 on guns and parts in the past year. They believe children are being abused on the compound. The head of ATF agrees that this is the correct target so that Congress can keep the ATF funded. Meanwhile, Gary wants Mitch to be investigated for his terrible orders at Idaho. However, Gary's boss says they can't do that because then it would mean the FBI is taking responsibility for Weaver's wife's death. At the compound, Thibodeau has acclimated to the chores with Michelle. Thibodeau and David talk about the requirements to stay in the compound. David had a vision that men are prisoners to their sexual desires. He tells Thibodeau that David will take on the burden of sex for all the men. All the men on the compound, other than David, are celibate, so Thibodeau must agree to give up sex. Once Judy gives birth, Steve wants to hold the baby, but David interrupts them. David says the baby has his eyes, and this pisses Steve off. A few days later, David runs with Cyrus again, and he realizes they are being watched. Later, Jacob is taking photos of the compound, when suddenly David pays him a surprise visit to greet his new neighbors. Jacob lies and says he's a rancher, but David knows for sure Jacob is lying. David invites Jacob and the other men in the house to come over later. At the FBI, Gary doesn't like the direction the agency is taking. They are bringing more guns to the FBI and it's becoming more of a military. His boss doesn't agree with Gary's concern. Gary goes to another superior to file a complaint against Mitch for his misconduct in Idaho. Back at the compound, a former lawyer, Wayne, goes over the problems with inviting strangers into the compound. They'll be open to scrutiny and legal issues like being charged against polygamy, and also the fact that David slept with Michelle when she was just 12 years old. CPS could take away the kids because of this. So, the group goes to Thibodeau to ask him to marry Michelle to solve their problem, in which he agrees. Afterwards, Michelle is pissed at her sister Rachel for allowing a grown man to take advantage of her. David had a vision that Michelle should be his second wife. The compound was hesitant about this, up until Rachel had a vision herself that God commanded Michelle be the second wife at just 12 years old. Even though Michelle cries, Rachel yells at her sister because the dream was real and they must follow what God wants. Then, Jacob has taken up on David's offer to come to the compound. Jacob takes it upon himself to learn the layout of the compound. However, Rachel catches him hanging around the women's quarters. During his sermon, David discussed the 7 seals. He says 4 seals have been opened, and the 5th seal is going to be opened when the army of Babylon come to their doors to spill their blood. Then, David tells the group that someone has broken a rule. He'll be giving them a licking for breaking that rule. He brings the group to figure out who took ice cream without permission. A boy admits to this, and instead of whipping him, David allows him to get a lick of the ice cream. Jacob sees that the people in the compound are fairly normal. Later, while doing the nasty, David stops himself when he starts enjoying himself with Rachel. He says he can't allow himself to succumb to the pleasures of the flesh. At the ATF, they strategize about how they are going to raid the compound. But they also strategically talk about how the media will cover all of this so that the ATF can look like the heroes. Jacob is there telling Ed Wiggins that he couldn't locate the weapons. Ed says Jacob needs to find something so they can have a better search warrant. In the compound, Wayne and Steve tell David that they can't allow Jacob to come there anymore. However, David knows Jacob was brought to him by God and he can convince Jacob into converting. Later, Rachel is upset with Judy for giving David advice on opening up their doors to Jacob. Rachel thinks it could open up their commune to scrutiny, which could eventually lead them to losing their children. At the FBI, Mitch has caught on to Gary filing a complaint. Gary wants Mitch to think 5 steps ahead next time. However, Mitch throws an old case in Mitch's face that he messed up in Sperryville, Virginia. Back at home, Gary tells his wife about Sperryville. Gary had tricked a kidnapper to come out and they killed him. Gary admits that he didn't feel sorry for the kidnapper. Finally, it's wedding day, and Jacob is invited to the ceremony. Michelle is walked down the aisle by her father, Perry. Thibodeau and Michelle tie the knot and the group celebrates. During the celebration, they invite Jacob to enjoy his time, and he does. Afterwards, the group appeal to Jacob by talking about his dead mother who died of cancer. This subject gets him really emotional. In the women's quarters, Thibodeau and Michelle flirt and talk about the great day they had. David thanks Thibodeau for his service, but makes him leave the women's quarters. That night, David takes Michelle away to be taken advantage of, while Thibodeau watches her leave. The next day, there's a newspaper article about David Koresh. Ed Wiggins thinks something like this could destroy the element of surprise, so they must act fast against Koresh. Meanwhile, a newscaster is lost and looking for the compound. He stops a post office man for directions to the compound, but unbeknownst to the newscaster, the post office man is part of the compound. He sees a bunch of ATF men in a car and rushes to warn David. Jacob is tasked to go into the compound by his superiors to make sure they have no idea that they are being raided today. However, the post office man has already warned David. David goes to confront Jacob and demands him to stop this raid. Jacob rushes back to tell the ATF that David knows they are coming and to call the whole thing off. Dad doesn't listen though as lines of cars drive to the compound. Jacob tries to stop them, but fails. Tons of helicopters are there and the people in the compound panic. The women and children are told to go in their rooms, while the men prepare their guns. David goes outside with his hands up, but a dog startles the ATF into shooting. David gets shot, so Perry goes to close the door, but he gets shot too. It's a firefight between the ATF and the men of the compound. Even Judy gets shot at and falls down with her baby. Steve and Wayne drag David out to cover. It's a non-stop rain of bullets when Wayne tries to grab the phone to call for help. Wayne tells the emergency dispatch that there are women and children in the building. Meanwhile, Judy is shocked to find her hand bleeding from the bullet wound. The women use mattresses to cover the children. Even one woman uses a gun, but ends up dying. Thibodeau makes his rounds to ensure all the doors are bolted shut. Jacob watches in horror as the two sides fight. ATF start to use ladders to secure position. Wayne has finally reached the Waco sheriff and the sheriff tries to get ATF on the line. Apparently, the ATF team did not bring communications at the compound, so they are unable to get a hold of them. Then, the ATF have entered the compound and start throwing flashbangs. Judy is deafened by it, while the two sides fight each other in the hallway. The ATF have to retreat because of this, as a few of them die just outside. One of the ATF officers tells the camera guy to call for help since they don't have communications on the ground. The cameraman reaches the sheriff, who tells the cameraman to tell the ATF to cease fire. Once David reaches Wayne and Steve, he tells them that the fifth seal is finally opening. Dave is feeling weak from all the blood loss and collapses. Eventually, the ceasefire command reaches both sides and they've stopped shooting at each other. The cameraman grabs his camera again to make sure he gets everything on film. However, an ATF officer takes it away from him. The cameraman is confused because ATF was the one who asked him to be there. Then, Jacob goes to help one of the wounded officers and puts him on his car while others help. Dad looks at Jacob, probably regretting having ever attacked the compound. Steve goes to check on his wife, who says David has been right all along. David talks to the sheriff. Sheriff just wants to know how many people have died, but David talks cryptically about the 7 seals. In the other room, Perry is in a lot of pain while his daughters hold him. One of the husbands was out of the compound that day. He decides to go back in for his wife and kids, but the ATF police end up killing him while his wife watches from a window. This angers David on another level. Gary and Mitch have finally arrived on the scene, but they don't receive a warm welcome. Then, Jacob gets upset with Ed for not listening to him. Ed says Jacob should have told him plainly, but Jacob says that's exactly what he did. Jacob wants to go back inside to talk to David, but it's outside of Ed's jurisdiction now that the FBI have taken over. Then, the group argue about the logistics of self-defense. Wayne says the ATF are not going to admit that they shot first. Thibodeau wonders who do they call if it's the government attacking you. Meanwhile, a radio show host comments about how law enforcement is supposed to de-escalate situations. They shouldn't be using military force. Then, David Koresh calls the show host. David explains their current situation. However, the FBI cut their lines to the outside world other than to contact Gary. David wonders why the ATF attacked them. However, Garrett doesn't know the answer to that. Garrett tries to negotiate David to come out, but he refuses. Garrett bribes David that they'll share his message on national TV, and in exchange, David will surrender. David agrees to these conditions. Then, Gary goes to Jacob wondering who fired first. Jacob has no idea. The cameraman's tape has gone missing, so they'll never know who fired first. While David goes to record his message that will air on TV, he hears commotion in the kitchen. He gets angry with his people for being happy because people died protecting them. Meanwhile, Michelle prays for her dad. Thibodeau stays with her to help ease her pain. Eventually, Perry can no longer take it and wants to die in the compound. His kids say their farewells before they shoot him dead. The next day, Thibodeau's mother, Borlenda, has arrived in Waco. To her surprise, she meets David Koresh's mother. Borlenda pretends to use the restroom so that she doesn't have to sit next to her. Bed does a press conference and lies about how they were attacked during a routine search warrant. Bed also suggests that it's possible Jacob may have compromised their secret plan of attack. Jacob knows this is an utter lie and leaves. After the press conference, they play David's hour-long message to complete their part of the bargain. David switches around the channels to see what other people think of him. They all think he's a loony since David claims to be a messiah. David is obviously disappointed by this. Then, Jacob confronts Ed about throwing him under the bus. However, Ed doesn't care. Afterwards, Gary contacts David telling him a bus is coming to pick him up now. However, David says God spoke to him and he isn't going to come out anymore. This was the first 3 episodes of the TV show Waco. Would you like us to cover the last 3 episodes?
Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps the channel.